All right, so filter setups. So let's talk about filter setups between the versions and I guess just between classes. So one of the biggest things that I see misunderstandings is, and it's across the board for Betaflight and even into other flight firmware, the PID loop and the PID, the base raw PID controller is the same. Um, it's the same across Betaflight versions, and it's the same across firmwares, really. I mean, the math is so simple that it's hard to really make it any different. At the end of the day, just I'll just use one example, but the P term, you have your sticks where you're commanding the quad to be, and then it's measuring the gyro is measuring the roll rate. So you're telling you move your stick to the right. You say start to roll at 2 degrees per, or let's go 25 degrees per second. So you move your stick to the right. That starts at 25 degree per second roll. Well, you're commanding 25 degrees per second to the right. Your quad starts to roll to the right, and the gyro is reading that roll rate, 25 degrees per second to the right. And if you keep your sticks held over, it will just continue to spin around, just like an airplane doing a barrel roll. So that math is just the P term is really where the stick is, where the quad actually measuring it. So that's called the PID error. So it's the gyro, or it's the set point, which is your stick, like how much you're telling it, 25 degrees per second to roll rate to the right. The gyro is saying I am rolling at 10 degrees per second. So when it starts to first roll, well, it needs to be more. So let's just back up a second. When you first move your stick over, you say to go from 0 degrees per second to 25 degrees per second of roll rate to the right. When you first move your stick over, the quad's going 0 degrees per second to the right. So that's what the gyro is reporting. The PID error is the difference between the two. So it's 25 minus 0. The PID error is 25. It takes 20. The P term is 25 times your P gain. That's it. It's pretty simple math. There's really nothing to it. So this thing we're like, oh, the PIDs are different. It's all the same. The gyro loop is so simple that it's in all things I've seen so far. It's your P term is your PID error times your P gain. Your D term is the slope as that starts to roll to the right. The gyro starts to read a certain slope, so it's like an acceleration to the right. That slope of that gyro signal, so it's moving from 0 degrees per second and it's accelerating up to 25 degrees per second. That's the D term, so it's the slope of that gyro signal starting to roll over. That's multiplied by the D gain, so it's the slope of it's either of the measurement, the direct measurement of the gyro, or the PID error, and that's your D term. So it's, again, really simple math. Take one point divided by the next point. It's the slope of the line. Multiply that by the B term is D gain. So between versions of Betaflight, back to this question. So you're going from Betaflight 2.0 and you're going up to Betaflight 4.2. The PID controller is basically the same thing. So if you had PID gains from one version, you can use it on the next version. There's no difference in that core PID controller. There's same thing kind of for the filter settings as well. Oh, I'm getting you guys let me know if this starts to get worse on stream quality. I hate this thing. But the filter settings, the core filter code is the same between versions of Betaflight. Like the core PT1 filter and the biquad filter, that core equation has never changed. It's always been the same. There's different cutoffs. So if you had cutoffs and settings that worked from one release, you can use those in the next release. Same thing when you're going from like a Flight 1 scenario or if you would know from KISS. Now KISS doesn't give it to you in cutoffs. It does have notch filters and it tells you the cutoffs. But if you know the cutoffs for like a Flight 1 frequency filter, well, it's the same thing as a PT1 filter. It's a first order low pass filter. And you can use those same settings intertwined. So I guess I get a lot of questions like, hey, I did it this way, now I go to this next release and it's something. It's like, it's not the PID controller, guys. You're missing something. Something has changed. Either you crashed in between or something else is going on, but the PID controller really never changes. There's stuff around the edges that change, new features that are and kind of go around the PID controller that change, but the core math and the core thing of how it works never changes. Same thing with the filters. So I guess back to the premise of the question was, what's a good setup for filtering? So a good setup for filtering with Betaflight now, and this was kind of the goal, to have kind of a universal setup, is just the standard stuff on the wiki. So I would recommend, if you can, have RPM filter enabled. So you go up here to the configuration tab, and you would enable bidirectional D-shot. Make sure to count your motor magnets, so that's on the outside of the bell, number of magnets on there, and get that enabled, get that working. You'd obviously enable this with your props off, get this saved and rebooted. I just have a flight controller here, I don't have it plugged into anything. But then you would, with your props off, you'd plug into a battery. Then after this is enabled, you'd hit save and reboot. Then you would come to your motors and move these tabs up. You would see a percentage error here. You want to make sure that percentage error is less than 1. So I guess I can do that here quick. It's going to get all wonky, but you'd see a percent error. So when you spin up the motors without props, you would make sure those error percentages are less than 1. As long as those are less than 1, then you go to the filter tab, so your RPM filters are working at that point. You go to the filters tab. The general setup is I would start with filters at 1.0. So that adjusts all these things right here. I would set your dynamic notch to be 0 width, 250 for the Q, around 125 for the min, unless you have to go less, and 350 for the max. So there's some things in those setups of the dynamic notch here that the reason it's changing, because when you have motor noise, so your quadcopter, the raw frequencies that, when we're moving the sticks and it's doing prop wash, those movements converted into like a frequency domain kind of spectrum. Those are the spectrographs you see, and I'll pull one up here in a little bit. Those are down at like they're like 1 hertz, 2 hertz, 10 hertz, 20 hertz kind of. Prop wash is 30 hertz, maybe gets up to 80, 100 if you have a well-tuned quad. So anything above 100 hertz is junk we don't want. Now you can't just cut it off, because it doesn't work like that. You have a steady stream of data, so there's nothing to cut off. It's just numbers coming into the flight controller. So the only thing you can do is kind of attenuate those with filters. So anyways, from the higher frequencies up, when the dynamic notch is, when the RPM filter is off by default, the dynamic notch is set up in a way that it's taking care of all the higher end motor noise, so the stuff way up here. And when you turn on the RPM filter, that's then going to take care of your high frequency motor noise, right? So now the dynamic notch doesn't need to do that anymore. So what we do is we adjust settings so it's, we make it, instead of with this width at 8, there's actually 2 notches that the dynamic notch is moving around at the same, they're relative, the centers are 8% apart. That's what 8 means for percent width. If you put it to 10, they're 10% apart, and that's 10% of the frequency. So if it's like at 250 hertz, the center frequency where it's at, hitting those oscillations, it moves it up. So the reason it's a percentage is as the notch goes higher, like from 250 hertz to 350 hertz to 450 hertz, as you go increase in RPM. I think I'm getting into too much detail. Notches get wider as their frequency goes higher. It's just how the math works. So we make the notches get farther. I should go this way. So they get farther apart since they're wider and can attenuate more. So anyways, setting this to 0 makes it just 1 notch now. And then capping it at 350 hertz puts it in low range. And at low range, that means that it doesn't go as high. It won't go up above 350 hertz. So your motor frequency, like the frequency and oscillations you get from motor vibrations, can be anywhere from 300 or from 200 hertz up to, on a little micro 2-inch quads, this little sucker, these things get up to like 800 hertz. Now, if you're kind of new to this and you're saying, yeah, 3.5, 0.7, I'll get to that. If if you're kind of new to this hertz thing means that when it's 350 hertz, that means it's 350 vibrations per second. So imagine something going up and down 350 times per second. That's what 350 hertz means. So 200 hertz means it's going up and down 200 times per second. 100 hertz, 100 times per second. So as your motors spin faster, that oscillation obviously gets faster. The reason we're keeping the dynamic notch down at the lower frequencies, is kind of restricting it, is because the RPM filters are handling it up higher. And the RPM filters are filtering, they're one notch per motor. So as you go around turns and one motor spins up faster than the other, there's a notch targeting each motor because each one is vibrating at a different frequency, right? Because this motor is now spinning a little bit faster than this motor. So the hertz of the vibration is a little bit more. That was the good part of the RPM filter. It can track each motor independently based on its RPM. The dynamic notch only has 2 notches. It's looking at the whole spectrum on the roll axis, trying to find the highest frequency on the roll axis or on the pitch axis independently, and it's sitting on top of that, but it's not necessarily hitting each motor's frequencies. So the best setup, again, is RPM filters, because now you can track the vibrations on each motor. And then you have the dynamic notch there that's restricted down lower, because the low frequency vibrations are the ones you really need to worry about, like the stuff between 100 hertz and 200 hertz that really start to bring out jello, starts to bring out the shakes that you see at full throttle, things of that nature. And the dynamic notch can stay within 125 hertz to 350 hertz, look for higher peaks of vibration, jump on top of them and crush them out. So that's where you want this dynamic notch, and then what you can do is move these sliders up together generally. You don't have to do it together, but you can. I mean, that's the general advice. Move them up together, try to simplify it. Honestly, we would have just had one slider, but if you've been using Betaflight for a while, you'll know that the gyro filters don't follow the PID profile, but the deform filters do. So that's why we had to have 2 sliders. So that might change in the future, but as of right now, it's 2 sliders. So you generally move these up together. And why do we, move up the low pass filters versus turning off the dynamic notch? Like, why wouldn't you just keep these at 1 and just turn if you don't need it, why wouldn't you turn the dynamic notch off? Because low pass filters generally have a lot more delay associated with them than notch filters do. So that's why. So the overall best filter setup is the same. I use the same filter setup from a whoop to I have a 9-inch quad I'm tuning for somebody. Same filter setup. It's just how far can you move these sliders up, and that depends on how much vibration you have, which depends on the props, which depends on the frame. Depends on a lot of things, that the quality, the components, things of that nature. So same setup. RPM filters enabled, which I don't have here. So let me go here. Let me see if I can see what happens when I do this with the stream. You enable this, hit save and reboot. See if this wigs out. And then get the dynamic notch set up like I just talked about. And then go ahead and start to slide those sliders up. As I usually go up, I know Joshua Bart, he takes them up to 2.0 right off the bat. I usually go up to 1.5 on the sliders. So I usually get this set. I'll try to get these up to 1.5 and then I'll leave them. So here, I can set this up like that. Right there is generally the filter setup I try to get on all my rigs. I might try to I would say general advice, this is the best thing. If you really want to start threading the needle on stuff, you start to reduce these harmonics. Sometimes I do. I'll take these from 2 harmonics down, or 3 harmonics down to 2. But I would, if you're not looking to just play with stuff, sometimes people in the hobby, you got to keep in mind, some people want to tinker with things. Some people just want to go fly, right? So if you don't want to tinker with things, do that. If you want to tinker with things, you can do other things like take this down to 2 harmonics, turn off the dynamic notch if you want, move these sliders up even more. But I would not turn off the dynamic notch unless these sliders are moved up all the way. You know, I would move these up all the way. And honestly, even then, instead of turning the dynamic notch off, I would start to turn some of these things off. I would turn off the low passes. Low passes filters have way more delay than notch filters. So generally, that's the thing. So let's address the 3.5.7 thing. So I see that John's videos and then turns on the sliders all the way up even more. Basically makes the motors hot. Yeah, the more you move the sliders up, you know, you're reducing filtering, so your motors can get warmer. That high frequency stuff, your D term goes crazy. So the D term amplifies noise, but the higher the frequency of the noise, the more it even amplifies it. So it will amplify a 50 hertz noise by maybe 2, but a 500 hertz noise, it will amplify it by like 1,000. So the higher the frequency, the D term will amplify, because the slope is, imagine an oscillation that's going up and down every 100 times a second. Now imagine that same oscillation, same magnitude, but it's going up and down 500 times a second. Well, the slope of that oscillation goes from this to that. And since the D term is taking the magnitude of that slope, multiplying it by the gain, it magnifies it like crazy. So that's why you really got to kill out the high frequency stuff as much as you can. Yeah, and if your motors get hot, you went too far on the sliders. You have to bring the stuff back down. I try not to go too crazy on the sliders because I want to leave some room so that I can move my gains up higher and not have to worry about it. I prefer to keep that. So going crazy on moving this delay. Another is move your gains up. So that's something that I don't think we talk about too much in the hobby. When you're moving this PD gain slider, when you move this up, that's reducing delay in the signal because it's going to advance the signal because the gain multiplier is higher. So even on the P term, it's going to slide your P term up in time. Same thing with the D term. If you slide it up too far, you'll start to get high frequency oscillations. So reduce signal delay. You know, when you're taking a signal, just how the filter works. Obviously reduce the amount of filtering. Rigs, power to weight stuff, you need to increase the gains because they move slower. And increasing the gain strength gives more push and also takes out some of the delay in them moving, in the craft moving slower. All right, let me go back here. I do have a super chat I had to hit. Still running 3.5.7. So I guess I want to go back to that original question a bunch time before here. What's the best filter setup? Like I just said, the filter setup that I just talked about, that's the same thing I'd use on the 3-inch all the way up to a 9-inch quad. Same thing. So it's pretty straightforward. The another thing you'd want to make sure to do, I guess, before we miss it, because I do see it on here, is Crunk had it on here. Use 24 kilohertz on your PWM frequency and your ESCs. 48 kilohertz is smoother motors, but it reduces braking torque. So there's a trade-off. It's not a, hey, I'm going to 48 kilohertz, my motors are smoother, but there was no negative ramification. Yet there's always a negative ramification. There's no free lunch, right? So what did you give up? You gave up motor torque, mostly motor braking torque. So unless you need that flight, 48. I used to change until I understood more clearly through Joe Lucid and talking to Ryan Harold. But the whole 48 kilohertz movement to get smoother motors, it was never articulated a couple years ago quite clearly of what we were giving up to do that. And you can. So what will happen is if you go from say you need the 48 kilohertz for smoother motors in your ESC software, you will most likely need to, if you go from 24 kilohertz and you want to move up your ESC refresh rate to 48 kilohertz, you will most likely need to increase your PD gains down here. So you'll move this gain up. So if you switch up to 48 kilohertz, just come in here, you basically just have to retune. Vice versa, if you're going for 48 kilohertz and you're coming down to 24 and you're like, I get all kinds of oscillations. Well, yeah, because you need to reduce your PD gain because now you just made your motors more powerful. So your power to weight ratio is higher. So you're gonna have to move your PIDs down some. So going up to 48 kilohertz, you have to increase your PIDs. Going 48 down to 24 kilohertz, you have to decrease your PIDs. And that's what this PD gain's. iTerm, say about iTerm too much in these regards without getting into the other thing I saw on here, 5.7. Hey guys, I got to tell you, the 3.5.7, if everybody loves that so much, that's just because you like those defaults. The PID controller is the same as, so 3.4 came out. To have it done in time. So they half release for 3.5.7. 5.7. The 4.0 out, it had biquad filters as a default, which we learned was had some advantages, but they don't do as much filtering down low, but like below this frequency. So whatever this cutoff is, like they don't filter as much down. Like say this is at 100 hertz, it doesn't filter as much. It would be a biquad down below 100 hertz. Like a PT1 is kind of more. The roll off of the filtering is more gradual, where a biquad it's kind of straight and then it just cuts off a lot steeper. So that had issues. So then we went back to a PT1 type of filtering scheme, and that's what Betaflight 4.1 is on now. That's what Betaflight 4.2 is on, and the Betaflight 3.5, there is specific things that are way better in 4.1 and 4.0, 4.1, and 4.2 that are just, I mean, Betaflight 3.5.7, what is a good release. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. The thing that's weird about it is sometimes people throw it as like a jab at the Betaflight devs, but it's like, guys, you're insulting the people that gave you 3.5.7, so don't insult them. Like, they're the one that developed the thing you love, so why are you trying to insult them? And for a fact, there's stuff in it, like the dynamic notch. We were working on stuff that did not get into 3.5.7, that it's in 4.0. And feed is cutting in and out. Oh, great. Let me turn this off. See if that helps. Yeah. Is that any better? It still says the feed quality is garbage.